So we kind of forgot about that. But anyway, there had been definitely an interest in language. There had been an interest in literature, and there had been an interest in writing, and all those things come together where you get translation. So I kind of explain it to myself in that way. But of course, that doesn't really answer anything, because when you start out translating, or when you start out studying a language, you don't know what it is that you're doing at all. At least not if you begin as a monolingual person, right? Because what does it mean to learn a second language? What does it mean to learn to step into a very, very different space of not exactly being between two languages, but being in two languages at once? You don't know that until you do it. So, how about that? I translated that book, First Snow in Fuji, as my senior thesis, basically because I'd read the collection over the summer. And I was just completely bowled over by one of the stories in particular. I thought the collection as a whole was amazing, and there was one story in it called Silence that I just thought was incredible. And I wanted my family to be able to read it, and I wanted my friends to be able to read it. And I thought, well, I'm just going to have to prepare something for them. That, and then also I was in the creative writing program studying with Joyce Carol Oates. And I was just sort of talking with her and threw out this idea, and she liked Gauvin a lot. And she said, why don't you do that? I would love to read that. And so then I had this very odd experience of translating First Snow in Fuji for Joyce Carol Oates and having her read it and tell me that she thought she could see a sort of ghostly old Japanese man behind me as I walked in and things like that. The kinds of things that Joyce Carol Oates says, and you get the feeling that she probably half means it.
In contrast to retranslation, we have all the books already out there in English and so forth. They're known quantities to some degree. You've been translating a lot of younger Japanese authors and really introducing them to American readers, including like Sayonara Gangsters and that's pretty recent, and he was completely unknown. How do you find them in Japan? I went to Japan on an editorial trip and was overwhelmed and confused because there's like there's a lot of publishers. They're publishing millions of books. All the books are there for like 6 months and then they're gone. There's not really a collective memory among the editors of like what was great 10 years ago. It was very difficult for me to get a sense of it. There's no agency to tell you what to be reading. How do you do it?
It's not exactly true that there's no memory. I mean, the things... The system, the publishing system, is very, very different. So, for instance, just to give you kind of one, a nice compact image of how different and confusing things can be, only paperbacks, are categorized by publisher, not by author. And in Japan, authors do not publish with one publisher. In the U.S., usually you'll have, so-and-so is published by this house, so-and-so is published by this house. It doesn't work like that. In Japan, it's so-and-so publishes with everyone, because you can never say no when somebody comes and asks you to write a book. Because you don't have, if you're a writer in Japan, it doesn't have an institutional affiliation, first of all. There's no such thing really as a creative writing department. So the writers, I don't know where they get their health insurance, but they get it somewhere and they pay for it by producing book after book after book after book for every publisher out there, from the biggest to the smallest. And all of those books, when they're published as paperbacks, are put out on the shelves by publisher, right? So you have to know who published the book in order to be able to find it, right? And there are dozens of publishers, which means that you have to know who published the hardback, which may not necessarily be available, and anyway, it is complex. But hardbacks stick around for a while. So what I do is I just go and I look at the shelves every time I go back to Japan, and I try and spend at least a couple of months, usually in the summer in Japan, every year if I can. I just go and I get stuff and I buy it. And it feels, since there is some possibility that this will turn into a poor business decision, I could publish it and get something. I can trick myself into believing that it's okay for me to be looking at these books and reading them and enjoying them instead of doing something more practical, like writing a book that may sell 800 copies on a very abstruse topic that nobody really cares about. So yeah, it's not actually that hard if you just go and look at hardbacks, things, read everything that you can, and keep track of it, is all I can say.
Okay, I want to take a second and segue into this. There's a magazine, Kelp, that is all about translations entirely. I'm sure we have it here in the library. It's fantastic. And last issue was a huge feature on Michael, a huge interview, long interview, and then a little section about Big Toe P, what is the full name? The Apprenticeship of Big Toe P by...
Excuse me, what's the name of the magazine?
Kelp?
Okay.
Like C-A-L-Q-U-E. By, what's her name? Matsura Riko.
Matsuda,
Okay. Yeah. But The Apprenticeship of Big Toe P is a strange book, a long book, an 800-page book, a book about a woman who wakes up one morning with a penis as a toe, correct? Or a toe as a penis, whatever we end up. Anyway, so you wanted to publish this book, or you wanted to translate this book. You got involved with an organization called the Japanese Literature Publishing Project that funds translations of certain Japanese books, finds publishers for them in other languages, or in English, and then pays the publisher a certain amount of money to publish those books. And that's all great. The part that was interesting about this, to me and to other people, was when you talked about that it was important to have the Japanese government behind this. But the other reason that this book was able to get published is because you worked with Elmer Luke, who is an editor, who was the first person to introduce Haruki Murakami to English language readers, everyone, and helped edit the book. And he's saying here that he and I worked to fine-tune the translation, to prepare it to survive in the American market, to make sure it wouldn't remain buried in the chips and wires of my computer, unpublished forever. You tried to keep a sense of balance, so on and so forth. Okay, so what's interesting is reading the first two paragraphs of the original version and then the edited version.
which are both published here.
Yeah, which are both published in here as like a comparison so you can see what happened. The first one is that Mano Kazumi?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Mano Kazumi was very close to an acquaintance of mine. I myself didn't know her well enough to call her a friend. Since our only connection was through this third party, we had only met 2 or 3 times, and a full 2 years has passed since I last saw her. It came as no surprise, then, that I had trouble calling up an image of her face until she was actually standing in front of me, which is pretty good, pretty smooth, a lot of longer sentence structures.
So that's the first paragraph of the unedited version.
Yeah. And then the first paragraph of the edited version, I had met Mano Kazumi just a few times. She was very close to an acquaintance of mine, and that was how we were introduced. It had been 2 years since I last seen her. And then it goes on to the other thing. So much more clipped, much shorter, much more direct.
Maybe half the length.
Yeah, in terms of lines, it literally is at 6 and 3. So this came out, and it was interesting. And the book is being published by 7 Stories Press in this edited version. It is 7 Stories.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. There's always a caveat when it comes to the JLPP. But hopefully 7 Stories is bringing it out. So it is getting published. Now, after this issue came out, it apparently caused a bit of a fury, and there was a number of people who wrote to Cal complaining about the way that this was edited. Okay, at least one. And it was this woman who wrote to them, which they published this letter online, which I found really very, very interesting. So she says, in comparing the unedited translation with the edited version, one can see that the changes have been made according to a certain pattern, which obviously reflects the aesthetic view of the editor. The first 2 long sentences have been chopped into much shorter sentences, and what is conveyed indirectly in the first version is expressed telegraphically in the second one, as if the narrator was answering a police questionnaire and was summoned to give the most unambiguous, direct answers possible. But she's not answering a police questionnaire, she's narrating a book. It goes on to sort of imply that this was like the American version. Like there wasn't it wasn't okay to keep it close to the original, have this Japanese sentence, these long sentences, this kind of more billowy prose, but that the editor and the American publishers wanted it to be American style, in a sense. And you responded to this, but I'd like to ask you again, like, what you think about that. Because it is one of those issues that comes up, like keeping things foreign, making them more accessible. But this seems larger to me in a way, because it seems to be implying that there's also a culture surrounding it, and we're trying to put it into our culture. Mm-hmm. Take it away. There's no question there, but you can respond.
This is hopefully something we can all respond to.
Yeah.
And first, just to kind of back up a little and set up the background. It is actually, I mean, the question of how you get, especially this book is in the Japanese 2 volumes, over 800 pages long, which from the start damns it pretty much. There's no way that you can get. I mean, it's different probably for a Western classic or something, or for a classic. The Tale of Genji, say, right? You can even publish it in English in 2 volumes if you like. For a new book by a completely unknown writer. And what's more, this Matsura Ryoko is one of the least prolific writers in Japan today. I said that people write all over the place for all of the publishers. I compared her, I think I've forgotten somewhere, to another writer I've been